Hello, my name is Maestra Moraga. I'm the co-director with Celia Herrera Rodriguez of Las Maestras Center for Chicana Indigenous Thought, Art, and Social Practice. And this is the first time, it's been a bit of a time, I don't know, is it 1 or 2 years that we had a pause in our programming with the Latine Public Voice series. And people seem to enjoy it. I really love the opportunity to be able to talk with, folks that we really feel as, Chicanas that have a particular voice to offer, have a certain perspective, a critical thinking that we often don't see in our daily news, or we don't see even in, in looking at sort of, critical conversations that happen across the nation. We experience ourselves as somewhat invisible. And so this was an effort to really see what we're thinking. This particular series is largely focused on writers, poets, periodistas, folks that are have a history in the Chicano movimiento, largely now based in California or born in California. We have a Tejana was born here in Corpus Christi. But really the enfoque is trying to also make sure that we do have something to offer about as we age, in our own generation aging, that we have some point of reference for younger people to say where we've been and also where we're going, how our ideas have developed over this time. So I'm really happy that Rosa-Linda is here with us today, Rosa-Linda Fregoso. I will tell you a few things about her, but also I look forward, to this conversation. Rosa-Linda and I have known each other off and on, really, right? Just off and on for many decades, and we were trying to remember sort of those spots of time, and it's been beautiful to have you back and with your marido. It's just anyway, feels good, like a little homecoming on a certain level. So Rosa-Linda Fregoso is a Professor Emerita of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is the co-editor of Terrorizing Women, Feminicide in the Americas, published by Duke University Press, the author of meXicana Encounters and Making of Social Identities on the Borderlands. Her early work, the Bronze Screen, some of you may have read this early on, Chicano and Chicana film, and that was 1993. Lourdes Portillo's The Devil Never Sleeps, and other films. I love that word very much because I love Lourdes' work. And, of course, most recently, The Force of Witness, Contra Feminicide. Feminicide. I want to say it in Spanish or English, so I stumble. And it was published this year by Duke University Press. So partly what we've been trying to do is also to enfocar on current works that have been coming out in the last few years. And so this is a case in point. I was very interested. Also just seeing that we have not really spent that much time. We did have Cristina Rivera Garza here that did talk about Mexico and violence against women and the state of Mexico right now. But this work is about that. And so we wanted to also bring some topics to bear that we haven't had a chance to really cover. And really, Rosa-Linda this is her work. This is how she defines her work in recent years. So I was hoping, to just begin, I had some questions about your own sort of professional journey, just kind of a little bit, in terms of your biography, how you went from being a periodista really to, now, I mean, really your work, you're also an activist, and you also are a scholar. So just wondering if you could say a little bit of time in terms of just your history about how you got to that point, and then I want to have us talk about the book.
Okay. Can I start by talking a little bit, well, first, let me just say I wanted to thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here, and I just think the work that you've done, you and Celia have done to create this Institute of Las Maestras, it's just phenomenal. I just want to say that, and I thank you. And I had a desire and a secret desire for you to invite me, and I'm so glad you did.
I'm glad. I read your mind. It was just
no, but I also wanted to say a few things about the project, because I think it's important to say that first and foremost, this book is an homage to the activists, to the Contra Feminicide activists, to the amazing, amazing activists, scholars who bear witness, to feminicidios, to murder and disappearance in Mexico. It's a homage to the mothers who became activist mothers in the struggle for social justice, to the activists who risked, and in many times, can take, who risked, and in many cases, were criminalized, for demanding social justice. To the periodistas, the journalists, who also risked, and in many cases lost their lives, speaking contra poder, and to the artists, the artivists, who inspire us, who envisioned new possibilities, and inspired us to continue to resist and to struggle for social justice and for better futures. So this is, I just wanted to say that this is an homage to them. I like to quote Maurice Condé, who says that the world changes and the writer changes, with it, And as I chronicle in chapter 1, this sensitivity to change is expressed by my involvement, my participation, and my work in the Contra Feminicide movement, which actually had a profound impact on me. It really taught me much about the power of struggle, the power of solidarity, and about collective resistance. The essays were written in the course of 10 years. And it was after the publication of the book that I co-edited with Cynthia Bejarano, Terrorizing Women, Feminicide in the Americas. And I initially wanted the first chapter, Chronicles of Witness, to be a kind of to be the introduction to the book, and I wanted to leave the idea of witness sort of as a submerged or implicit, like a narrative thread in the book, but I decided to go with an academic press, and then the reviewers requested that I do a more theoretical framework for the book, and so that's what the prelude is. It's a short prelude, but it theorizes, what I mean by witnessing, and they asked for that. And in terms of the writer's voice, you mentioned the writer's voice. There are 3 narrative voices, in the text: memoir, reportage, and analysis, and in one's diary, one usually writes kind of in an unfiltered voice, a little more like memoir writing. There's a distinct voice in journalism, which is more descriptive and reportage, you report on events. And then the academic voice leans toward the more analytic. So it's those, I work to combine those 3 styles. I've been a diary writer since I was a child. And we talked about poetry. I used to write poetry since I was a child. And then a journalist throughout my 20s. And then in 1982, I went to graduate school, so I kind of developed the academic voice, And then the final, I wanted to say something about the title, The Force of Witness, because I wanted to emphasize that witness is not an individual, but a chorus of humanity, and so that's the emphasis on that, on using that concept, And also Taylor, one of the graduate students, asked me today about force, the importance of the word force. And I really wanted, because a lot of times when you think about witnessing or testimonio, it becomes like a mediated text, it's more of a textual concept. And I wanted to emphasize the force of witness as actions, and movements, So it's not necessarily a literary text or a mediated text as a testimonio, but actually movement and action and acts, If I can, I wanted to read part of, because I'm not sure how much we're going to get to do this, but I wanted to read like where I explain this, if you don't mind.
Please do.
Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
This is what I write. The force of witness is the name given to the different modalities of feminist witness discussed in these pages. Witness is not solely an individual or an autonomous subject, but a constellation of multiple social locations and practices. As conceptualized here, witness is constituted by interconnections and social relatedness. A force field of human thinking and doing, witness is multiply situated across deeply textured and heterogeneous worlds. Rather than an individual act or practice undertaken by a sovereign subject, the force of witness involves a collectivity forged on the basis of ethical and engaged planetary obligations and interdependency. Instead of a universalist vision, witnessing emerges from pluriversal imaginaries. Each modality, endeavor, and presence of witness dealt with here is context-specific, linked with and contingent on the event witnessed. For witnessing cannot be analyzed outside its specific context, apart from its conditions of possibility. Witness affirms the dynamic, spirited connection between seen and unseen worlds. So, in that sense, witnessing constitutes relations with the Contra Feminicide movement, with or to the Contra Feminicide movement, to the feminist efforts to eradicate gender violence in Mexico, to the activist mothers, to the artivists, who are all involved in anti-patriarchal struggles and resistance, I also talk about like I said, the force of witness deals with actions, with actors, with movements, that affect social change, and that created these practices of reciprocity, of solidarity, and of collective resistance. And so I end the prelude by, making reference to this as well. And I say, we gathered as border witnesses and participants in the political mobilization contra feminicide. Some brought their expertise in grassroots modes of organizing, others their support and shelter for survivors of gender violence. Feminist researchers contributed their scholarship, journalists observed and documented the protests, artists depicted the unbearable violence, and evoked utopian imaginaries of love, abolition, and nonviolence. We all arrived to honor the dead. Some among us are witnesses to ourselves, survivors of gender violence, artivists with childhood memories of sexual assault, activists who endured workplace harassment, males concerned about violence inflicted on their female kin. The life force of solidarity and resistance is often interconnected with one's own vulnerability, one's autobiographical encounter with the death force of violence. We came in the spirit of solidarity and communality, forging intersubjective relations that ground the act of bearing witness in human connections, the force of witness. So that's,
That's beautiful.
And in each of the chapters that follow, I have a conceptual and historical chapter, chapter 2, and then each of the chapters that follow are case studies of different forms of witnessing, So,
yeah.
And I'll kind of leave it there because I know you have a lot of questions, but I didn't want to sort of kind of give a
I appreciate
framing
it
of
too,
it.
and I also there's other things I would like you to read from as well, but I think one of the things that impressed me, and I thank you for also explaining sort of a little bit also of the history of what was being asked of you to when you took it to Duke, like different, and the different kinds of languages you're using, because I think, well, I was saying to you earlier today, I read everything as a writer. I don't know how not to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this book achieved something really, really tremendous, and you're actually saying it. But it is this way in which that the women that you referred to are your teachers,
Yeah.
right? And it's like there's a kind of, I have lots of questions to ask you, and it's probably going to go all over the place, but there is a certain worldview in it that binds the whole work together. And even that I was saying, to my pareja Celia, I said, girlfriend has read and read and read and read, and I say that with all respect, because in one page you have, there's the footnote, but not for justification's sake, but of your idea. but to say this is common cause. Like you keep referring to people like, and they said it beautifully and you say it beautifully before they say it beautifully. I mean that there's a kind of integrity in how you put this book together that I respect very much and I was very moved by. And even when it was too much, even when I'm going, wow, this is so layered, and then she told, there's just like the too much being that it is thick with meaning. You know, like nothing is wasted. And so I was just, you know, I had all 500 million notes, and I was looking at my book, and I might as well have just written the whole thing out, you know. But partly too, and I mentioned this to you, that there was something in this one, because when I got the book, and it was right after Latamani had presented, and I got this book, and we know each other also through Lata knows, you know, etc. But I'm so interested in our generation and what we're doing new, you know, how we're moving forward, right? And so, and I like the voice of it right away, and then the structure, because the structure is, as you were describing, but also that this analytical is then, there are these moments that you called interludes, right? And the interludes are always they're oftentimes visual work. They're related to visual work. And they're also, they describe these, you know, the protestas, and the protestas are ceremonia, you know? It's like that they're just, so there's a lot to talk about here. I don't know how we're going to get through everything. but the structure of it to me also seemed very brave, you know, that you were doing, you know, this is an academic text, you know, in that sense, but it is an activist text, you know? And so, and when you bring in the language in itself, also does have its own kind of poetry to it by virtue of its sensibility, you know, that there's body in it. The whole thing, there's just body in it, you know, and as it should be. Because even when you're writing analytically, there's body in it, which means this is bodies we're talking about. You know, we're talking about this, you know, we're talking about murder, you know, so, and female bodies, you know. So the thing is that so I wanted to say that, and I wanted you also, what I had done, because I was interested in the book, I'm saying, what is she doing here? And I went right to the end, right? And so, and it's really, and I want people to know that she's reading it in the beginning, but this piece happens right at the end, and you call it a postlude. You know, you have your prelude, and this is your postlude. And would you mind reading that?
Oh no, I don't. I don't mind me reading it.
Okay, good.
You want me to read it?
Of
right?
course, I
Yeah.
want you to read it. And
My-
this, I mean, and what I appreciate about it is that too, and it's a little bit like when you're reading this book, where they say when you give away the plot or something. What's that word they say, like? But so tell me, someone in the audience. Spoiler
Oh, spoiler alert! Oh,
because the point is that, and the question I was asking you to, when I said, tell me a little bit about your history, is, and you beautifully said that it's the work that changes us, right? But what initiates conciencia? What initiates us to even wake up, to even pay attention? Because that's the major question, you know? Why as Chicanas, as feministas, is el trabajo que hacemos? And there's always this moment of conciencia where something's not right. There's a place of agitation. And so when I read this ending, I said, aha.
that's
you know,
the place of agitation.
Yeah, that's the place of agitation, yeah. So please.
Yeah, so it's, you are an artist, you know.
You said that like an accusation.
No. I'm saying it's like, you know, you're a seer, you know what I mean? That's what I meant by an artist, you know, you are. You envision. My daughter and I arrived at supper time. Cecilia greeted us at the door and walked us down the hallway into a brightly lit meeting room behind the Presbyterian church. The fluorescent lights in the ceiling reminded me of the bingo hall at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church back home in Corpus Christi. The only items I packed were our own pajamas, 2 days' worth of clothes, toothbrushes, deodorant, and face creams. I forgot the toothpaste and the bar of Ivory soap. The straw beach bag was so full I could hardly clasp it shut. Cecilia led us to the 2 twin beds with headboards separated by a small table with a forest green lamp. There I placed the beach bag and sat down. I'll explain the rules and daily routine after supper, Cecilia said in a calming voice. Her warm, deep brown eyes and cropped hair reminded me of my beloved Tia Fina. It was a humid summer day in 1977. I wore a short, light blue jean skirt, a peasant blouse, and sandals. Still, I was sweating profusely, my palms sticky, the sharp odor of penetration scenting the air around me. I turned my focus to the smell of chili and cornbread coming from the kitchen. I cracked my knuckles as I often did whenever I felt anxious and fearful, a constant tightness knotting my stomach. I hope he doesn't see our blue Toyota in the parking lot, I thought, the car my mother had co-signed for. The room smelled of pine saw. Clean, I told my daughter. The sheets were washed with Tide, like at home, I added. Mom, I don't like it here. I want to go home, my daughter sobbed. I held my daughter's hand tightly and stroked her head. It's going to be okay, sweetie. Don't worry. Plus, we're having chile con carne with cornbread for supper, your favorite. I like chili dogs better, my daughter responded, pouting. I heard the garbled sound of women talking and walked into the multi-purpose room. The TV in the background broadcast the theme song of Bewitched, a show my daughter and I often watched together. The laughter of kids filled the air as they ran around the meeting room. A baby cried while his mother changed his diapers. Another was being breastfed. I looked around the room and noticed all the windows had rolled down shades and thick cream-colored curtains. There were 12 seating stations, twin beds arranged by twos in parallel formation. 11 other women, each with 1 or 2 kids. 20 or so survivors sharing a night in one of 89 recently opened shelters for battered women seeking sanctuary from abusive partners in the United States. For the first time ever, I met other women who had left violent lives, determined as I was to forge new paths. I recognized my daughter's pained expression on the faces of other children. Yet despite our mutual despair, we shared a collective desire for a promising future. For the first time ever, I could sense the possibility of a life free from violence. I could envision freedom.
It's beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing that. So there's I think there's so many levels in which to approach this work, because you have approached it on so many levels, right? I mean, you've entered, the question of the violence against women, and it's in focus in La Frontera and in Mexico, but podemos hablar de, all of throughout the world, really. There's some kind of sort of concrete sort of political questions that arise in looking at and how one approaches the question of violence against women. And you make a clear distinction between femicide and feminicide, right? Mm-hmm. And could you talk then about what that means to you, and then also sort of how that impacts abolition feminism or anti-carceral feminism? Yeah. And define those terms for folks too?
Yeah, I think, like I said, the second chapter is a historical and the kind of conceptual chapter where I deal with these kinds of issues. Right. And there's a debate. I mean, feminicidio was a term that was, theorized by 2 Mexican feminist scholars, Marcela Lagarde and Julia Monares. Julia Monares in Ciudad Juárez, Marcela Lagarde in Mexico City. And it wasn't the first time that it was used. It was used in the Dominican Republic in the 1980s, mm-hmm. And so they began to, talk about feminicidio, as a way of dealing with what was happening in Mexico, and framing it in terms of like human rights violations of the rights of women. Femicide has been, it's a 19th century concept. That's the first time it appears in a British dictionary, but it became a part of feminist lexicon in the 1970s. It's the Canadian sociologist Diane Russell, who was based in Oakland. You know, she was
I
at.
worked with her,
Oh,
actually,
you?
for a
Well,
period of time.
yeah, she was the person who first, you know, used it and theorized it to really kind of politicize gender violence against women. And also to, you know, talk about kind of patriarchy. And she, through the years, she had kind of different definitions for femicide, but basically it was kind of the gender term for homicide, but also politicizing and making it a public issue as opposed to a kind of a private issue, a family issue. And I think the way we have begun, you know, to theorize it in terms of feminicide is to really kind of introduce sort of like the structural dimensions of gender-based violence, you know, the intersectional quality of gender violence. So we felt that focusing on kind of gender as women, violence against women, and also patriarchy as a single axis of analysis was too limiting.
Of course, yes.
You know, because there are other structures of inequality, colonial histories of racism, you know, and other structural issues that are also part of gender violence. And I think in this sense, critical race theory is a kind of a good analogy, because critical race theory points us to the structural dimensions of racism, as opposed to, I mean, of course, racism is committed by individuals as well. But if you just focus on that, you miss the institutional and the structural and the systemic parts of it. And that's the same, it's kind of, that's the analogy with feminicide.
It's interesting too, because somehow with women, right, it becomes personal in the way it's made to be personal and not structural, in the way it's not so with race. I mean, that race is, I mean, there's kind of a much more sort of embedded understanding that this is, you know, is that racism happens personally, but it happens very evidently structurally, but violence against women is so privatized, right?
Yes.
So that's why, I mean, I think that has something to do with why it's kept that way.
And that's why it's important. I mean, the concept of feminicide is important because it talks about also the structural dimensions of, because you can, if you can eliminate all the sexism and all that you want, but you'll miss the structural dimensions of it, how it's embedded in institutions and structures, in schools, in religion, in law, you know. And also I think the other aspect of feminicide is also that it's important to talk about like the colonial histories, that gender is not universal, but there are also different colonial histories that are also part of violence, gender-based violence, but also emphasize that it's not just against, you know, women. When think about the dichotomous categories of gender, you know, categorical thinking about gender, that it's much more fluid. The genders are much more fluid across histories, across cultural contexts, and we wanted to draw attention to that it wasn't just against, you know, it wasn't just a binary, you know, but that it was much more, you know, complex, you know, and stuff.
I do want to talk about, I guess I do want to talk about the anti-carceral part, but I want to hold that idea for a minute. And I want to talk about what you were just saying about the relationship to colonialism, right?
Yeah.
And so the specificity of Latin America, you know, and Mexico, et cetera, about the specificity of that cultural sort of relationship to, and colonial relationship to violence against women, right? Yeah. And I think here, of course, of Maria Lugones and the work that she's done in that regard. So, and the real question that comes to mind, and there's some things I would like you to read related to this, but the real question is, why Mexico, right? Why Mexico? Like, why? What is the particular nature of the violence against women and the viscerality of that? Why Mexico? And that's why you bringing up, and you do really respond to the questions of the colonialism, you know, in relationship to that genealogy, right? So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
That's where the focus was of the work. And as I mentioned, that I started working on this project with Lourdes Portillo, who was doing the film on it. Yes. But, you know, the feminicide is across the Americas and in other parts of the world. So it's not just, And you know, and more recently, I've been working with, you know, younger scholars like who are Afro-descendant and indigenous scholars who are doing, you know, complicating the concept of just the focus on gender. They're really kind of doing a lot of the empirical work to talk about how it is that colonial histories in Brazil, for instance, or in Colombia, you know, it's very different from the colonial histories in Mexico. And they're bringing that to bear so that we can look at like what are the risk factors? And the risk factors is not just gender. That's why I meant feminicide. You can talk about like kind of intersectional structures,
Absolutely,
you know, which
yeah.
is colonialism, which is patriarchy, which is neoliberal capitalism, and all that. These are all kind of the conditions that, you know, that place people at risk, you know, for this kind of violence. So Mexico just became the focal point because of Ciudad Juárez and how the activists began to call attention to the murder and disappearance of women on the border in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s. But you know, once you know, when we did the book, the co-edited book with Cynthia Bejarano, where you have cases in Central America, cases in Argentina that we you know, people wrote about in the book, you know. So it's not just Mexico. So,
yeah, I didn't mean to imply it was just Mexico, but
yeah.
I think that there's a, I guess, that there's a particular tenor to what was happening along the border, right?
Yeah.
And a particular viscerality. And also you talk about, which really affected me very much, is like also in talking about Afro-Mexicanas. We understand that it's in other places, you know, of course, you know.
Yeah.
But I think what was moving to me too is that because you're also, you know, talking about this combination of elements with the drug carteles y todo eso,
Yeah.
and then also aggravated by the U.S.'s, you know, U.S. complicity in all of those, you know, when you're thinking about all of Central America and neoliberalism, all of this. The book is full of all of these layers, you know, and there's this kind of, that one, I wondered if you want to read that one part where the I forget his name now, the periodista does that kind of, when you were at the, it's a hard one. It's a hard one.
Yeah,
I see you do the hard, the Victors,
Yeah.
And because there was a way in which, and then you come up with hope, right? And so, I mean, I think that we feel that. It's like, I guess because somos mexicanos, you know, that what is this, what is the ugliness of this, you know, and also it's like, I remember in the play when we did New Fire, and we did a part where the woman's trying to get well, and she has to remember the violences that she experiences, and she can't get well until she realizes it's a we, right? Not just me get well, but we, which the book is full of this collective understanding, interrelational understanding. And at one point, and she says, and the actor comes out, beautiful Filipina actor comes out, and she's gathering her daughter, you know, the bones of her daughter into a trash can, you know, trash bag. So this character is trying to get well, and she says, women, es que somos basura. Women are just so much trash, right? And that part, and you talk about that, and particularly how that's experienced for indigenous women and also Afro-Mexicanas, and that the sense of it is that it no vale nada. They're not, you know, and that is very visceral, right? Yeah. So I'm wondering just sort of your reflections on that, you know, because you also had to witness so much of this, and the particular cultural tenor of it, you know. I'm not saying there's not every place else. It's just I'm interested in that part of us, you know, like what happens in our own colonial history and patriarchy that has shown its face in this way.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, you point to it. I mean, you have the in Chihuahua, and then you wanted me to read that part, and that's at the People's Tribunal,
right,
Permanent People Tribunal. But you know, if you think about what was happening in Chihuahua, you know, in the 80s and in the 90s, you know, and it was like the development of neoliberal capitalism. You had the interpenetration of cartels with an existing, you know, corrupt government, and you also had the militarization of policing and security, and that was funded by the United States.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So
Yes.
you have, those are the kinds of complicities. Those are like the structural conditions, right, that create that possibility for feminicide and for the impunity around it as well. You know, and so that's a conjuncture of all of these sort of basically systemic forces. And of course, then we're talking about, you know, when we talk about patriarchy, the devaluation of women, you know, what lives matter and which lives
Exactly,
matter
yeah.
lead. And, you know, the majority, well, the wonderful work that, you know, indigenous and Afro-Mexican feminists are doing is they're disaggregating the data, because you have like, okay, 5,000 women, but wait a minute, what's the class, what's the race, what's the, you know, these kinds of things that are now being, you know, research coming out about, you know, the feminicide, that it's not, you know, upper class white or, you know, women in Mexico are not the majority of the victims. You know what I'm saying? So there is those kinds of complexities that we need to start beginning.
And the women are very well aware of it. I mean, that's what she
Yeah.
makes clear, is that they know who, you know, who's expendable.
And I quote one of the mothers, you know, who says, you know, for the poor there's no justice. If they murdered a rich person's daughter, you know, the whole police force would be out.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah.
so those are the. I mean, I'm not trying to say that it doesn't happen, but I'm trying to say who are the bodies that have the greatest risk, the greatest vulnerabilities,
Absolutely.
you know, and
Yeah.
then that's what we need to look at. And I think the concept, going back to the concept feminicide, the concept feminicide forces us to think that, you know, the who are the subjects, what are the bodies that have the greatest vulnerability, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that comes up too is that line of with impunity, right? And that line comes up a lot. You know,
Yeah.
this happens with impunity. This happens with impunity, and so the question always then emerges: well, what's the punishment, right? No consequence. There's no consequence for those actions, right?
Yeah.
Not that you have the answer, you know, but we, you know, there is a really the emergence of anti-carceral feminism, right, grows out of the very thing that you're saying about making these kind of connections that is structural. So if it's structural, right, and part of that structure is the carceral system, you know.
We have to dismantle that.
Okay, so can you speak a little bit more about
Well,
that?
I think there's issues around that,
Of
you
course
know,
there is,
because
but
and
that's
part
what we're
of
talking about.
yeah, no, I know you. I know you brought it up, but I think that's. I mean, you hit the nail on the head in terms of, and part of what I'm also. I mean, you mentioned decoloniality it informs my thinking. You know, feminist intersectionality, to talk about the intersection of struggles, and the feminist work on abolition, to kind of critique the growing tendency to criminalize gender violence. And I think that's like a lot, it's a passage of laws, like here in the U.S., VAWA, Violence Against Women Act and all that. It didn't make a dent in violence against women. You know what I mean? You can,
Well, that's the case you make.
and that you can, you know, incarcerate, it doesn't make a dent because you're not dealing with the structural, you know, foundations of it, you know. And I think that, you know, the critique is about, you know, the tendency to want to reform a system that's actually the root of it. You know what I mean? It's like we're going to reform colonialism, or we're going to reform capitalism. Those are the roots of what we're talking about. So we really need to dismantle them. And I think, and that's, you know, kind of like what I've learned from feminist abolition, you know, work, is that it's not enough, you know, to criminalize, you know, injustices. Or acts, you know. It's not enough, because you're not dealing with actually the causes of all of this. And I think that's, you know, part of what I'm trying to, you know, call attention to is the fact that passing more laws is not going to, you know, that's about reforming. It's not, we need to transform, you know, society. We need to transform those systems that are the systems of domination. And I think when I was saying that there's a newer generation of feminists. There's this great book by the journalist Laura Castañeda. It's called Terremoto Feminista, and she talks about this new generation of anti-violence feminists in Mexico and also in Latin America. She calls it La Cuarta Generación, right? And they're really about transforming the system. They're really about, you know, it's not just about reforming and passing laws. We really need to do away with all of that. We need fundamental change to be able to do this. And I think, you know, that to me, that's what the artists are about too. They're kind of, you know, showing us a vision for these sort of new futures and new imaginaries. You know?
And it does seem kind of on the daily, it's a really hard thing to wonder how we'd ever get to that place. You know what I mean? Of being able to really unlock all of that. I mean, is that what makes the criminal? I mean, what really makes the criminal? I mean, on any level, right? And the criminal, you know, you say some beautiful things. I mean, I don't want to get way ahead of myself here, but you know, there's a vision attached to it, and I think that, like I said, let me just try to find. I have a million notes here, but the vision attached to this really, you know, has to do with feeling that there is, like, even if you can't say what are the concrete alternatives, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking that way, right? I mean, because when people are saying, well, okay, well, so, you know, they're just going to get off. You know, I mean, it's like your mind can't even quite go there. And I think, like, when you're talking about regular popular culture, when you say abolition to them, you know, and what do they think? You know, it's like, well, it's crazy. You know, we need police, we need all of this. So in this particular case too, but I think that what is the most telling is that it's done no good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the most telling. So that much we can say for sure, it's done no good. You know, it doesn't keep the same way, you know, it doesn't do any good to stop murder in general. It doesn't do any good, you know, whatever you know, the issues are, whatever the crime is.
You know, my dad was, when he was a journalist, but my dad was, and in radio, but he had a program that he used to go interview people in prison, people incarcerated. And I remember when I was young, when he did this, and I remember he told me one time, he said, las cárceles son universidades del crimen. He said that's where people learn to be criminal in prisons. I mean, it was such an insight, but it's true. And I think, you know, I quote Aida Hurtado, one of your colleagues, her husband, Craig Haney, has done a lot of work on, you know, with incarcerated persons. And he talks about how the prisons themselves create these misogynists and racists, you know, these young guys that go in there and come out, these raging misogynists and racists. So what does that tell you? What my father said, you know, 50 years ago, exactly. the prisons are universities for criminals. I mean, that's where they learn, you know. I mean, that's what they produce. So that's not the solution. And I think I think we need to, you know, and it's a hard thing to do because you know, the mothers and the family members, they want justice.
Of course, that's what I was thinking.
And a lot of times, what justices do the state give us? It's criminal justice system, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's their solution, you know, which is penalizing, incarcerating, and all that. And you know, reducing funds for any kind of other kind of interventions, or for any kind of, you know, transformative justice, you know, that can transform communities or repair damages, you know. It's always about retribution, you know.
Of course.
And there's that saying, you know, an eye for an eye leaves you blind, you know what I mean? It's not, you know, violence with violence it's not the solution. And I think, I mean, that's kind of like part of the project also in the book, is to, you know, call attention to that as well. I don't have the solution because I think it's a collective thing. We have to, as a society, you know, we have to collectively come with solutions. But we also know what doesn't work, you know, and I think that's the call attention to what doesn't work is an important thing.
I think so too, you know, but we also have to look at, you know, what's just happening globally at this very moment, right? I mean, it is you know, Palestine, Israel.
Yeah.
It's like this, and you're thinking, how many more people have, this is crazy, and the United States, you know, 100% behind that.
Yeah.
You know, and so I mean, what we learn from the broadest, you know, you're talking about structural, you know, so you're talking about, you know, globalization. What happens in that context, right, is the message that it is an eye for an eye and tooth. I mean, that's Ukraine the same way. Ukraine, they just keep going, and so there isn't, it's a counter narrative that's it's a growing voice, but it's still a very, very, quiet voice. That idea that you could actually envision a world without that, with that,
I'm very hopeful that it's happening. I mean, look at all the people that are out. I mean, you don't see it in the media, in the U.S. media, but look at all the people that are coming out in solidarity, including Jews for Peace, solidarity with Palestinians, So I think there is this growing, and you see that also in terms of like the response to feminicide throughout, in Latin America and in Mexico and all that. This new generation is pushing in that direction. No, we have to transform capitalism. We're anti-patriarchal, We have to, we have to do these sort of very fundamental changes, and then they're pushing us for that. The younger generation, I think, that's where my hope is, because they're, they've already said it's not working, and the feminist activists that Castellanos talks about in Interrelational Feminista, they're like, they bring together the environment, the ecocide, with feminicide, with racism, they're like really bringing all the stuff together. You have to think in those terms. You know what I mean? We can't silo things.
They're integral.
And Palestine, what's happening now it's all connected. That's why, and the world is seeing that way.
Yes. Very, very much so. So let's talk a little bit about, when you're talking about this hopefulness too, I think partly the thing is the descriptions that you have here of all of the respuestas, that these communities of women are doing, and how art is used, how, ritual is involved, and all of it, and they're very hands-on and it's kind of very presente and humilde in the same moment, that there's just, there's so much fuerza in it when you're talking about force, right? So maybe you could, also cite certain moments in the work that were particularly, that you have here, they're particularly impressive. Also, I love the part, if you would just read the part about the nails, that's what I just kept saying. I think it's on The Art of Witness on page 119, this experience that you had, that you were looking at, the Ni Una Más crucifix.
Oh, God, yeah.
And it begins, there are 268 nails.
Oh, yeah. It's, okay, there are 268 nails encircling the Ni Una Más crucifix. 268 nails in memory of the women and girls murdered in Ciudad Juarez. After crossing the Paso del Norte International Bridge, we spotted immediately the large wooden memory cross on the Mexican side of the border facing traffic that passes into El Paso. It is attached to a 12-foot metal panel and bears a placard edged with the slogans Ni Una Más, not one more, in remembrance of the women and girls. I've stood before this memory cross on many occasions. This time my sister Angela accompanies me, and we are both grief-stricken by its scale. The throng of 6-inch spikes that once held tags with the names of deceased women. It is a haunting sight to behold. 268 iron spikes. I try to count as I walk closer, wrap my fingers around one surface, cold and raspy to the touch, close my eyes and try to conjure up the lives the Ni Una Más crucifix mourns.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
There's so many, you cite many examples of that, of different jornadas that people take, and the altares, the role of altares from the home altar to the street, right? You want to speak somewhat about that?
Yeah, and I think that's when I was telling you that I learned, so much. I mean, we all, if we grew up, in Catholic Mexican households, we have the altares for the dead and things like. But I learned so much because of the mothers, the activist mothers. They would always make an altar when they would do their protesta, their protests. They would always make the public altars, and I always felt like the presence of the women and their daughters there, because it was a way of conjuring, and all that. And so that's kind of what I learned, the importance of them bearing witness to the memories of their daughters. You know what I'm saying? So it was, and they did it all the time, and they brought the dresses that, they did with Irene Simmons,
Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, well, there, you know, she would have workshops. She would do workshops with community people. This is the artist, but she also had workshops with the mothers, and they themselves would do, you know, dresses, or whatever, you know, clothing, and then they would put it on pink crosses, you know, and all that.
They would use their own daughter's clothing.
Yeah, they would bring that. The mothers would do that, you know, and I mean, the incredible pain, but the incredible power of that as well. You know what I'm saying? So it wasn't just one thing, you know, and they were, and I felt like that there was a lot of, you know, conjuring of the spirit of the daughters there, you know, and you know, people would say that too. You know, you talk around it, you can feel it. You know what I mean? That kind of that thing. So.
Well, you say too the expression. One of the mothers says, "Somos muertas en vida," like the living dead, right? What really moved me about it, and I'm kind of going to give this back to you, is that there's something, you know. I guess I want to ask you this too. They're just saying largely they're mestizas, you know, madres mestizas, right? And that, and what is it? You know, we're both mothers, whatever. But what is this? The particular that relationship, both you call it like spiritual, like political spiritualism or spiritual politics.
Yeah, that was Amalia Mesa Baines' concept of politicizing spirituality.
Yeah. That, and it's so and there's also a relationship that I noticed a lot to the land, right? The desierto, no, the dirt, and you know, all of it, like just the dryness and also again it just brings back the feeling of the bodies, you know, and each of those women's bodies and young women's bodies where they were found, and you know, the conditions of all of it, and the mothers. I was just very moved about that, and so I guess I wanted to ask you something about, you know, what is it about Mexican mothers, you know? I mean, you know, I'm just saying is that it resonated so much, so deeply with me that this kind of particular, like, for all of my, you know, I haven't called myself a Catholic since, you know, 17, you know.
Yeah.
But the only churches I'll go to is in Mexico, which has something to do with sort of like a sense of the depth of the faith that doesn't really seem to have too much to do with Jesus and, you know, all of that. Even though all of those symbols may be used, particularly La Virgen, you know. And you had talked about the relationship to religion and political practice in this way. So what is your feeling about it? I mean, you're there. You spent a lot of time with these women, you know. So how would you describe them and their you know, their seres, you know, like how just you're there.
Well, I mean, they are very, you know, religious in that sense, and I think that gave them solace, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I also think, I mean, as a feminist, I like to kind of re-signify, because it was, and I quote, I'm trying to remember her name, but anyway, I quote her, who writes a lot about this. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Anyway, where she talks about how the cross is re-signified by it, because you put women's clothing on it, or you put, you know, you do other things with it, and with the cross, and so you gender the cross as well. So I think, I mean, I like to think about it in that way, but I think, you know, I mean, I participated in a number of things, including like Day of the Dead, that the family members, you know, themselves did. Like when you're talking about in this chapter, The Art of Witness, we do go with the mothers when they erect a monument, a cross in front of a monument in the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez, on the highway facing, you know, between Ciudad Juarez and Chihuahua, and they put this cross, the Justicia cross, on there, you know. And in that sense, they also kind of gendered it, and they put it in front of the Umbral del Milenio, which is the big monument that they have when you're driving from Chihuahua on the highway to Ciudad Juarez. You can see this big monument, and they put it right there in front, you know. And so they kind of re-signal, and this is a state park, you know, and they just take that over, you know. So they kind of used it subversively, and that's why what Amalia Mesa Baines' concept of of politicizing spirituality.
Yeah.
You know, that's how they politicized that, and I that's why I like that concept, because it allowed me to also see how, what they were doing as well was not just, reproducing what the church teaches.
Yeah, it's
they
not
were,
this, it's not
yeah,
this, yeah.
no, they were using it, and they were resignifying, and these
And that's the
practices.
point too, where one woman where the I don't know, the park keeper or something comes up to her and he says, "Do you have permission? Do you have permission from the government to do this?" And she said, "Did the government have permission to kill my daughter?"
Yeah.
So these single acts of resistance like that.
And it was a very powerful. I also talk in that chapter. They're erecting the cross and they're on top of a flatbed writing their names of the daughters, and one of the mothers is giving the names, and they're just writing it with like a marker, right? And they can't get to the very top. There's like about 15 journalists there. There's about like 30 family members, and there's like about 5 or 6 of us that are kind of working in solidarity with them, accompanying them. And at one point, the journalist from Reforma, because they couldn't reach the top of the cross, he just moves this camera to the side, gets on the flag, he's a really tall guy, and starts like writing the name. And we were like in shock because, because he just kind of was in the moment, and he just participated because they couldn't reach the top, and so he got up there, And other journalists took pictures of him, but I thought to myself, oh, he's going to get fired after that one, But yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
So it's just kind of the way that it, the way that it worked in that sense.
Well, so we're, kind of moving through this. There's like, I was impressed how much, on a certain level, because of these acts as well, that there is a lot of hope in this book. That you arrive at a lot of hope, and a couple of things came. One thing that I found quite interesting, and I do want to I want to talk a little bit more too about the sort of, like, you keep using the word interrelational, you keep using the word collective. Everything about this book is we, and I think that's what I appreciate so much about it, is that, and I almost, in a certain way, I kind of marveled at your ability to do that, because you are talking a lot of different languages, right? And that you're able to hold them in this text is phenomenal. It's like it really is. It's hard to do. You worked hard.
You're very generous.
No, it's really true. I know how hard it is to write. So, but anyway, so I think that the thing is that in that, so I do want you to say more, because I see also too, I have to say that oftentimes in academia, certain languages emerge, right? And people are using them. And with all, and people use them sometimes in ways that don't feel like they have bodies to them, that don't feel full, And here you're using words like intersubjectivity, interrelational, different kinds of things, that languages that are used a lot in academia, but somehow you're creating a landscape of bodies, that there, and I know I keep saying the same word about it, but it is very much grounded. There is land. There's a piece of territory here that you're talking about, a border, and the areas around this border. And and I think too, on a certain level, it also kind of shows a sense of an understanding of the environment, right? It's happening kind of in an integrated way. So I just, besides just saying, I think it's so great that when you're this interrelational part, right? How does that come to you? How does that come to you? In your activism, that as you're with folks and you come up with the language of this is interrelational, right? It really resonated for me in this particular text. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, when you use the word collective, and that you can cite so many people and somehow it's still a we, right? Including you, that you're part of the we writer, right? Just your reflections on the writing process in that way, and the languages that were coming to you, and having to use a lot of different languages.
If you think about, you mentioned the interludes,
Yes.
and there's an interlude, Veronica Layton, who did the sculpture Flor de Arena.
Sí.
And I mean, I thought about that because of what you're saying, the land, because she uses the sand of the desert, which many of the bodies were found in, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
And she does this monument to the, 450 women and girls who were, victims of feminicide. She did it because, there was that court ruling in the Inter-American Human Rights Court where the Mexican government had to do memorial, to that. And she kind of, the point I want to make is that if you think about that sculpture, it's so much about, it like embodies collectivity, it embodies intersubjectivity, it embodies interrelationships, right? And these are not my concepts. These are these are concepts, I mean, I've read a lot of decolonial theory. These are concepts that come out of, native scholars as well, I mean, I'm thinking about the Wintu. They say, no you without mountain, no you without trees, no you without forest. It's always this interrelationship. And, in Mexican culture, when you think about, the Days of the Dead is coming, the boundaries between life and death are very fluid,
Yes.
And that comes from, part of the, indigenous traditions, as well. So they're, it's not your ancestors live with you, they're part of you, they're in, and I think that, so I've learned that from the activists and the mothers and the mother activists and the artists, and, that's where I've learned that, but it also resonates with a lot of what I've read as well, and other kind of, scholars have also tried to think and theorize about, I mean, even Buddhism has these principles as well. So they're not just, from the Americas. They're from many parts of the, of the world that have these connections that have been severed. You could talk about by, Enlightenment theory, modernity, by capitalism. They've been severed,
Yes.
And but at the same time, but they're still there. They're submerged. I mean, people practice them all the time, and so that's kind of where I learned it. It's not something that I kind of invented myself, but you see it in action, and other people teach you that, and that's kind of what was important to me to learn that. And I think, I've liked to work a lot with artists, because for me they're visionaries. They see things. They like seers. What they see sometimes with whatever you want to call it, the third eye. They see with at another level. And they point to new possibilities and new futures and all that. So I think that's kind of where I've learned a lot of this as well,
Well, I think it's evident, I think that what I like about it is that there is I didn't think you invented those ideas.
No, I know you did. I know you did, but I was trying to say
I'm trying to kind of also, I don't know quite who our audience is, so I think that sometimes it's important, like that people that aren't familiar with certain sort of languages too, like how'd you put that together, and that you, that's what I appreciate about it, is that you put things together in a way that really then resonate on a lot of levels. I always feel the Buddhism in this work, But also, and that was one of my questions, I said, well, like, this is partly the thing, I said, how do you, to me, I was impressed. It feels like a very indigenous point of view, that they're very much so, particularly, about when you're talking about the sense about, not only, and there's definitely, if you're talking about ancestors and all that, that's more particular to our culturas, right? But this idea of certainly the relationship to the environment and everything is interrelated, and also, you said, en la cash, right?
Yeah.
Tú eres mi otro yo, I'm your other you, And I always remember that Holly Near song, it could have been me, but instead it was you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, and that's really what this is. It could have been me, but instead it was you, right? And you started that way. It was you for a minute in time, and that's why it's so beautiful. At the very end of the book, we find out your story, as a young woman, right, with child, right? So,
you think it was my story?
Huh?
You think it was my story?
Well, honey, if it's not your story, you fooled me really good. I have no problem. I have no problem with the they say autofiction, whatever. My students call it all kinds of stuff, and I go, whatever, because it passed through you. So it doesn't matter. That does,
No,
you know,
I know.
I know you're messing with me,
Yeah.
but anyway, but it passed through you, you know, and even when we write, you know, like I have a piece years ago that I wrote about in Giving Up the Ghost of my first play I ever wrote, and there's a rape scene in it. It takes 15 minutes to write, right? I mean, to say it, to this monologue. And as a case in point, you know, I have, as far as I can remember in my life, never been raped, right? But I was almost raped. And so I go through this scene with this young, you know, little Catholic little schoolgirl, right? And everything's the exact same, you know, things that happen. But all of a sudden I freaked out. I was able to get away, right?
Yeah.
And you know, and people come up to me and they said, oh, you know, like that. I go, pass through me, you know. It's like,
yeah,
so
yeah.
it and there's sites that we know, you know. I think just recently, you know, when I was doing this talk and I was saying, you know, that I'm not sure that I remember genocide. But I do feel like, when you're talking about sort of your bias, but I do feel like, you know, I do remember, you know, violence against women in a very visceral way. You know, it's like, and that could be genocide. You know, it's like there is no, it's just the point you're making. All of this, we carry all of this memory in us, you know.
Yeah.
And they are all interrelated and connected. Yeah. You know, so anyway, so I'm not worried about autobiography.
Yeah.
But
so
that's
why I mean it's at the that's why it's I mean
please.
It's at the end, but it's also the beginning. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's at the end, but it's also the beginning. So it's, you know.
Yes.
Those you have to,
that's the beauty of it.
You have to leave that that hope and that possibilities of, you know, that there is an arc of justice. You know, that there. It's long, but
well,
it's,
that's why we do what we do, right?
Yeah.
You know, or else we'd be at the bar and just drinking, having
or
another shot,
or surfing instead of
or surfing instead of Barbara, right? So I did want to, there was a place here that about language, right? And you do a really, you know, I know, and you've drawn from other, you know, critical thinkers on this issue too, about the word refugee, right? Because you spend time also talking about, you know, the conditions of, this is a really good, I think I'd like you to do, okay, I have so many of your quotes here. If you look at 165, and I think, and you talk about the refugee experience, right? Thousands of refugees from Mexico, and then I want to kind of follow up with that idea. I mean, with that part. It starts with thousands of refugees from Mexico on 165, I think.
Okay. Thousands of refugees from Mexico and the three countries that constitute the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, currently crossing borders, can be traced to the accumulated devastation resulting from the U.S. drug wars dating to the 1980s, the massive incarceration and deportation of Latinx youth gang members, the trafficking of arms from the United States to the region, and the growing consumption of drugs in the United States. By disingenuously assuming the role of passive victims of a brown invasion from the Southern Hemisphere, government officials disavow the country's complicity in the state of affairs that caused the problem, its active historical participation in the destructive politics of interventions, coups d'etats, extractions, and dispossessions that have left thousands of people displaced. As the militarization of the border reminds us, the deployment of U.S.-financed security forces breeds insecurity and precarity, and not stability and protection for border residents. And this is the whole chapter where I critique the notion of, I'm thinking that there should be an alternative to a notion of refugee because of the ways in which, you know, that whole system has all throughout the world. You know, I mean, the whole system of asylum seekers has, you know, dismantled, even though it's part of international law, you know, that anyone who feels persecuted for whatever reason, and, you know, in U.S. law, gender became the latest, you know, category of persecution that the Trump administration dismantled, and Obama had you know, put in place. So I think that, so the whole chapter is about us having to rethink that category, even though it's a legal category, and it's a sociological category, the refugee, it may not make sense given the way that international law is no longer even respected anymore.
Exactly.
In European countries and in the United States, the denial of this right to asylum, it's all over, the northern hemisphere countries. So,
Right. Well, I liked what you were. This part was very interesting to me, and also in this time of crisis, it is the fugitive spirit that we should evoke.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to read a little bit what you're saying here. By examining the vulnerable legal status of the refugee and asylum seeker through the anti-immigrant policies of the United States, I argue that labeling those who flee precarious living conditions as refugees has the effect of victimizing them even further. To be a refugee in the current context intensifies their precarity, subjects people to the whims of governments, and robs those fleeing persecution of their capacity to act as agents. The subject of fugitivity differs from the legal subject of the refugee in that the former is not invested in the normative status quo of modernity and coloniality as embodied in the juridical subjectivity, nor does it evoke the stigma of victimhood, which I thought was interesting. Rather, fugitivity is a form of epistemic disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was great.
Well, that's not, that's not me, but
no,
that's
I know
but
but you're
yeah.
using this
Yeah.
stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. You are a very cooperative, scholar. I mean, everybody acts like it's their own idea. You're not trying to own an idea.
Yeah,
Do you understand that?
Oh,
and I'm
yeah.
just saying, it's
Yeah.
like, so that is, that's major.
Yeah.
And you know how this is a corporate academy, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so that it's the competitive, it's not like that. It is like
Yeah.
you quote this person and then the next line that you have quoting somebody is equally eloquent and is informed by another person's,
Yes.
idea, right? So, but this what I thought was just so beautiful because that like the fleet, I love language, so that's why, and it is like you're saying, I know you work usually with visual artists, and I don't take it personally, but there are poets.
No, I do, but no, performance is performance too, of
yeah,
course.
there is performance, yes.
Yeah, yes.
But what I'm saying is that it's like, I think that when you're saying something about artists, it's also because this is imagining. This is imagining, to think of, that someone has a right to flee, that they're fleeing, and you make the connection, obviously, during slavery, and the freedom,
Yes.
you're fleeing toward freedom, right? As opposed to the victimization idea that you're refuge. Where's the refuge? I mean, that's the question. If there's no refuge, then how can you be a refugee? Which
Yes.
is really what you're saying, right?
Yeah, yes.
So I thought that was like, it was really, you say here, fugitivity and fugitives can thus be seen as actors and vectors in the transformation of capitalism. Like the fugitive from slavery who fled her captivity on the southern plantation, migrants in flight from violence and persecution in their home country enact an agency, a refusal and a defiance against nightmarish life worlds. They teach us what death and life may signify. So there with the death and life, you're going back to that stuff that the mujeres are saying. And, I mean, I have very recently one of my cousins, his son overdosed and passed. He's a young man, and they're just life and death. It's just like they're just walking dead. They're walking dead, and so this kind of way, thinking this way, making a life which is as of yet has no form, that has not been thought of, to live without reference, right? They teach us what death in life may signify, a collective search for making life, right? For making life. And this is Maria Martinez, that, and in that resides the hope,
Yes,
right?
yes,
right?
yes.
So,
I mean, you zeroed in on a really important point, and I think for me, African American scholars who have theorized, the fugitive slave laws, and and have thought about, well, what does it mean for you to be a human, but that has no legal personhood? You know what I mean? You're a human being, but you're property.
right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So how do we think about subjectivity under those conditions? Because like in liberal law, the subject is tied to property. You own your body. You know what I mean? That's the that's the foundation of, you know, enlightenment subjectivity. It's my body, myself. You know what I'm saying? What if you don't own it? If you're a property of somebody else's, what does that mean you don't have? So we have to rethink subjectivity, you know. And for me, that was what was so interesting about, you know, this concept of fugitivity. If the refugees, you have to have, a refugee means, presupposes a place of refuge. If there are no place of refuge, you live in these zones of, you know, between you know, heaven and hell, purgatory, you know, and these, you know, camps, you know. How do we conceptualize those subjects who did enact an agency? I mean, leaving. I mean, do you how hard it is to leave? I mean, people are coming from Venezuela. They're coming from all these places that the United States has been involved in and intervened, you know, and they've gone through tremendous hardships. They're human beings, even though it seems like their lives don't matter, their lives don't count, you know, their lives aren't grievable. I mean, you know how many people have died during that trek and we don't grieve them, we don't mourn them, you know? So they're what, like Judith Butler calls ungrievable lives, you know what I mean? And how do we think about their own agency? And that's why we're calling them refugees. I mean, I'm just trying to think about like the limits of that, and I think for me, the fugitivity and how you talk about subjectivity of people who did not have personhood in the legal sense helped me to think about, you know, the refugees in that. I mean, what we call refugees or asylum seekers in that way, you know. They're, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, to me, it's such a, like sometimes you land on certain ideas that, you know, oftentimes what you're talking about here are people that are just considered abject, right? I mean, that they're just no son nadie. You know, it's just like, it's so brutal in that way. And so you know, sometimes what one wonders, particularly in terms of people who are activists and politically engaged, that really have hands-on political engagement, you know, what is the language they need to have to you know, to be able to also work with people and say, no, this is, you know, it's like, this is, can you imagine, you know, it's like, they don't need to know they have agency. They don't have to use the word, but it's like, this, you are moving your life forward, you know, you are, and that is the counters all of this death relation, you know, that's going on all this time. There's so much happening all over the world now. That is that. And so anyway, I always like, I mean, that to me was really, really significant in this work, you know, that changed. So I think that, I know we're going to take a little bit of time to have people ask questions, and that's out in the land of our live stream here, you know.
YouTube? Is it like my grandson loves YouTube?
It's YouTube. Yes.
YouTube.
And also we have an audience for the first time. They've been very calladitos, very quiet over there, but I can hear stirrings, and so they may have questions as well. But before we get there, what I would like you to do, there's a bunch of but there at the very end, which is interesting, is that there is that coda. Right, you remember the coda at the very end.
Oh, yes.
And it is a kind of litany of facts, right? Mm-hmm. And it's been drawn from many, many people. Or you're thinking of many people. Each person, each thing you list in the litany refers to somebody else. And so, to me, I wanted to end our part of this with this kind of collective voice.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. So it's the coda to the chapter that we're talking about right now on fugitivity and the refugee. It's the chapter's called Stolen Lives and Fugitivity. Okay. The coda is, imagine the unimaginable. Your domestic partner in a drunken stupor beats you while you confront him about cheating and then sexually assaults you. Imagine he locks you inside your home when he leaves for work without food or access to outdoor bathroom. Imagine he hits you with his fists, yanks your hair, and when his family hears your screams, they come to join him in the beating. Imagine his brother is a police officer in a town where the authorities ignore your pleas for help. Imagine your parents abandoned you and you grew up in a household with grandparents who used cables, belts, and branches to discipline you and your siblings. At 15, you escaped this abuse and moved in with a boyfriend, only to discover he too was physically abusive. With nowhere to go, you return to your grandparents' homes, where an uncle sexually assaults you. Imagine you're attending beauty school when you meet the man of your dreams and marry him. Soon afterwards, he prohibits you from working or furnishing your studies. When you protest, he beats you with his hands and a broom, bangs you against the wall, and locks you in the house each day when he leaves for work. Imagine the first time he threatens to kill you if you report his abusive behavior. Imagine your husband turns even more abusive when he learns you're pregnant. He kicks you in the stomach, causing bleeding. After 2 similar incidents, the attending doctor no longer believes your stories about falling down the stairs and threatens to report your husband to the authorities. Your husband stops kicking your stomach, but continues slapping you and pulling your hair. Imagine you're married with 3 children and work part-time as a teacher in a private school. When you receive a promotion to full-time teaching, your husband becomes controlling and jealous, verbally and physically abusive, calling you a whore and accusing you of infidelity. He rapes you repeatedly and threatens to kill you. He keeps many guns in the home and his family has strong ties to the police. Imagine your husband witnessing his father's murder by cartel members who then search for your husband. In your home, the state of Michoacan, the Knights of Templar traffic in drugs and humans, and you hear rumors that they snatch children to harvest their organs and kidnap women for the sex trade. Imagine your dreams of freedom, freedom from violence, freedom from this horrific nightmare of existence, a freedom only possible if you flee and become a fugitive from persecution. Your only hope is a pilgrimage across the border into the land of the mother of exiles. You choose to leave and live. So each of those were taken from gender asylum cases. So each of the, imagine are different women in gender asylum cases who, were petitioning for gender asylum in this country.
You do remind me of I love the last line of that. I do leave. You do remind me of the question I did want to ask you is to say a little bit about the work that you've done that way of actually formally, serving as witness.
Yeah, well, I did, cases when I, stopped traveling for personal reasons and all that. I began doing, it was shortly after the publication of our co-edited book that I was asked to do work with people who do mostly pro bono work on gender asylum. And so I would be the expert witness, and I focused mostly on Mexico, but I also did the Golden Triangle countries of El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. I also did those cases, and I would just do the expert witness to validate. You had to be witness to the witness, so I had to validate their with data. And I had done I had a lot of empirical research on the cases and the states or how to find the information, because there's observatorios ciudadanos de feminicidio and women activists, some of them scholars and some of them local activists. They keep the statistics state by state in Mexico, and they do that also in the departamentos in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras. So I could get information so that I could provide validity to this person's statement, because her word or their word alone wasn't enough. You had to have an expert witness. So that's kind of what I did for a while. And then that kind of ended with even though it still started up again, but that my work ended with the Trump administration, kind of like the second year in the Trump administration.
Because of that? Because of
the law that was passed during the Obama administration, they rescinded it, the Trump administration. Right. So,
So does the witness, does she who bears witness to trauma experience trauma?
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think people don't talk about it as much, you know. I mean, I do mention it here as well.
I was remembering from
Yeah.
the description of you, the person next to you too, she was crying and you're trying your best not to,
Yeah, and yeah, this is during the tribunal, the Permanent People's Tribunal, the judge she was also a judge, and yeah, and I think there's yes, I think a lot of the activists and the scholars who accompany, you know, the mothers or the family members of disappeared and murdered, and who also take, you know, do interviews and all that. I mean, it is very traumatic. It's secondary, tertiary, however you want to call it, trauma, vicarious, you know, but you can never equate it with that trauma, but it is traumatic. And I think, you know, if you read, I think war correspondents have written more about this, you know, what they go through when they see the atrocities. And in a lot of ways, you know, what's happening in many of these, you know, places where I'm talking, there are atrocities. I mean, the chapter where I was a judge for the Permanent People's Tribunal I mean, you had 3 days of testimonies, and they were horrific testimonies, you know, and you see people break down and all that, and that's very painful to watch, you know. And it, of course, like I said, it doesn't equal what they're going through, because they live the living hell, and we leave, or we're, you know, we can go back to our families or whatever our lives are that are not that way, and they're living constantly with that. But it's very painful to see that, you know, and to grieve and to mourn with them, you know. It's also very painful as well. So I think it's important that we recognize that, and that we write from that space of vulnerability, because that, when you talk about the interdependence and the interconnection, I think, you know, walking, you know, in other people's footprints is a way of, you know, of being connected and, you know, with other human beings and understanding their trauma too. But it also impacts you as well. And I'm not going to lie about that, you know. I mean, part of there's a book that I read recently, Unbroken, she's Angela Sterritt. She's a Canadian Indigenous woman who writes about feminicide in Canada, and she got very, very ill. And one of her, you know, her friends basically said, when you get ill, that's the ancestors, you know, giving you a message, you know what I mean? And so I think that's important to think about whenever, you know, there's illness, you know, that all sickness comes from the ancestors' world, and they're kind of teaching us. And so that stuck with me a lot, you know, that teaching that your ancestors are trying to convey, you know, and it's part of illness and part of pain, and you have to listen to that, you know, because it's not coming from you, it's coming from something greater than you, you know.
Well, it also makes me think of Jack Alexander once saying that that what we do here heals our ancestors on the other side. So it's almost like the other part of that. It's the interrelational, right?
Yes,
I mean, I just thought that was like, I mean, suddenly I looked at, you know, my own ancestors, you know, it's like in a very, very different light that actually might matter. It might matter what we're doing. Or just even sitting here like, and but I think too, the operative word that you said too was vulnerability. That you're vulnerable in it. You know, it's you know, and that, which is very different than what's being told of you as a periodista, you know, that even though, you know, they are as well, you know, but it's like so you're doing this, you're crossing a lot of lines here.
That's why I mentioned this indigenous scholar, Angela Sterritt, who wrote the book Unbroken, because, you know, her vulnerability, I mean, she basically wrote through that. And I mean, it's a recent book. It came out after my book, but so I too bad I didn't have it too, because I could have, like, you know,
Yeah,
actually.
no, I've seen it. I've seen it. Yeah, I have.
Yeah, but she basically, you know, does that beautifully, because she's a journalist, and of course, that, you know, you're always accused of that if you're biased. If you're doing advocacy journalism, you're biased and all that. Of course, it only happens with people of color that were doing advocacy journalism.
Only biased people there are people of color.
Yeah.
Right. Well, okay, let's see if we have any questions. I think I'm going to turn this way to see what.
Can you see anybody? I can't see anybody.
I can see shadows.
Oh my goodness, that's good.
But in our group here first too, or Mariela? So we'll be able to hear you if you ask from there.
Does anyone have a question? Micaela?
En voz alta, por favor.
Thank you so much for your...
Say who you are.
Hi, my name is Micaela Diaz-Sanchez. I'm an assistant professor here
Gracias.
at UC Santa Barbara in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies. And thank you so much for all of your work. And for this conversation, it's an honor to witness it in this way. So to piggyback on Shadi's question about your own experiences, I'm curious about those practices that you have, that you engage in, Rosa-Linda, to maintain focus, to maintain your own health after witnessing and bearing witness to all of these atrocities. What are some of those practices as a writer, as a poet, as a person, as a mother? What are some of those practices? I have another one, but I'll just leave it there.
Well, thank you for the question, but I think for me, I mean, I could talk about different things like, you know, meditation, watching my diet, those kind of things that, you know, to kind of keep you kind of, you know, centered or whatever. But I think writing to me was really, really important, and I think that that's a practice that kind of kept me, you know, that kept me, I guess, sane, or kept me focused on what needed to be done, you know, because I mean, I've been, you know, like I said, I've been a writer since I was a child, and so I think just getting up every day and writing, you know, was really, really important as well. And, you know, I'm not sure if I'm doing justice to your question, but, you know, that's the thing that comes to my mind, you know, that was more important. And, you know, being also in community with folks that, you know, are doing this kind of work was also important as well, you know, to supporting each other. You know.
So in your work, do you keep ongoing journals while you're like traveling and doing that?
Yeah, all the time, yeah.
And then you also do that at home?
Yeah,
right.
all the time. And then also keep in touch with people who are doing the same kind of work, and, you know, sharing, you know, ideas, and, you know, yeah, it's really important to have a community of people that you're engaged with, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, do I need to turn around, or you just tell me?
I can just tell you. I'm just going to read a question off of the live chat on YouTube. And this is from Christian Vasquez, a PhD candidate here in the Chicano Studies Department. And this is the question. Rosa-Linda Fregoso has such an interesting history tracing back to the debates of de la Casas and Sepúlveda in the 16th century. How has the Caribbean thought from Sylvia Wynter helped shape the book?
Oh, that's an interesting, you know, I had that chapter that I wrote that I think that this, is it Christian who asked?
Yeah.
Christian who asked it. I had the chapter where I talked about, you know, it's a kind of, for a pluriversal declaration of human rights. I wanted it to be part of this book because, as Christian was mentioning, Sylvia Wynter's work was really, really important in terms of how we think of ontology, being, epistemology, and the kind of colonial baggage, you know, that we have to like undo. And a part of that is what we learn at the universities, and, you know, how, you know, modernity is, you know, the pinnacle of, you know, whatever civilization and all that. She's been so important in that sense. And I wanted it to be part of this book, but the reviewer said it doesn't go there. And I thought, God, but it was so foundational
But
to
those
me.
concepts are in there.
Yeah,
right?
but
the university, yeah.
They are there, but Sylvia Winters was more explicitly, part of what I quoted in that article, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and she's really kind of very important in terms of decolonial theory. She's a very, very deep thinker, and I love her work. I sometimes, it's hard to understand because she's just you have to really, really work. It takes you forever, like underlining and rethinking. But I think her work is very important as well.
Well, it is. I mean, I have to say that influence is evident. I mean, you do bring that. You make that reference several times throughout the book. So
I know, but I think it's more explicit in this other chapter that they made me take out. But
so they thought it wasn't. Say more about that. Why did
it didn't go with it? But I pulled out all the interludes for the artist stuff. I did pull them out of that article.
I see.
But I did. They didn't feel, because I was more talking about human rights as a kind of modernist Western concept.
Right. Yes.
That we needed to rethink. And she helps us to rethink the human.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
and so it was like I used her work, in terms of helping to rethink not just rights, because, there's a critique of rights, and I use indigenous cosmologies and epistemologies to be able to critique the modernist notion of rights, And then Sylvia Winters is helpful for thinking about the human part of human rights, And so she helps us to think about different conceptions of the human that are not the sovereign subject of modernity and the Enlightenment, right? But the human in relation to, like the Wintu say, know you without mountain, in relationship to other beings, that are not human beings. And so she helps us to think, through that. And it was through her that a connection with indigenous kind of cosmology and epistemologies that was very helpful to think through with her work on being and on the human.
Well, this all kind of rolls back to when we were talking about the sort of the anti-carceral thing. Like you're saying, well, what are the other options, right? And it really requires a completely different worldview,
Yes.
in order to arrive at any other possibilities. So I think, she's been, and she's kind of new to me that I began reading her recently, and I'm going and making that same connection with indigenous thought, and it's,
Yeah, I heard she gave a lecture one time. I think it blew me away. I mean, it was like, wow, this woman is pretty amazing.
That's great when that happens.
She's a pretty heavy thinker,
Yes. Well, it's a nota. Do we have another question or comentario?
Yes,
I
we
hear
have another
Coco
question.
making noise back there.
Yes.
Thank you so much for inviting me to listen, to witness to this erudito dialogue, 21st century vanguardist vision of what a possible horizon of un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos could be, right? Thank you so much.
Coco, say who you are.
My name is Coco Gutierrez Magallanes. I'm a lecturer at the Chicano Studies Department, at the Feminist Studies Department here at UC Santa Barbara. I have been trained as a scholar, as an undergraduate scholar here in the US and in Mexico City at UNAM. And I'm a transnational scholar, feminist, transborder, and mamacita of 2 young daughters. And I am very much interested in this dialogue between Chicanx, Latine, Latinx scholars with Latin America. And I see it crystallized in your work, in your book.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it so very much because there has been I think a probably 40-year time and space of silencio between the scholars of Latin America and Chicanx, Latinx,
Yes.
border intellectuals. And I have been working so fiercely for that to happen. And I'm so glad to be here to witness that you are doing that in so many ways. And that was not my question originally, but I wanted to ask you, how did you choose to structure your book through the musical writing, musical note writing? Hiciste un preludio, hiciste interludios, hiciste un postludio. How did you get to that choice? And without having read the work, I could hear the contrapuntos. I could see the flights of light, and I could definitely, I could feel the being part of that fugitive scholarly
Yes.
work.
Yes. Well put.
And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for that. I have
Thank
so
you.
many other things. But we would probably have a seminar. Hopefully we can.
I think I have two responses. I think my partner, my husband, is you know, a connoisseur of jazz and music. So it's always in my house, and then I have a grandson who is a very gifted musician. So I think, and then, you know, I always had a secret passion to be a guitarist, you know, when I was very young. I've never been good at it. I've never been good at it, taking lessons many times. But so I think, you know, and then, you know, my father was also, he was a, you know, a radio journalist, but he was also the music director. So I grew up around music. I mean, I probably know all the canciones rancheras, you know, and this is in South Texas, but I probably know the words to all of them, you know, I can sing them all. But anyway, so I've always been around music, so that was kind of a natural thing. But I did want to say something about something that you said. It's Coco, right? Is it about, you know, I think there were moments in history, in you know, the beginning of Chicano studies, from what I remember, that there was these attempts, you know, to make these connections between Mexicana scholars and Chicana scholars. And I think there was a lot of paternalism in that relationship, and also in the universities. In Latin, if you think about many of the, you know, post-war Latin American studies departments were founded in, you know, after World War II as part of, you know, this good neighbor policy, trying to, you know, create, I guess, these, you know, anyway, brought scholars from Latin America here, and many of them were very elitist too. And so there was this sort of always this, well, you know, you don't speak Spanish well, or you don't this, you know, there was always this kind of sort of yeah, there was like a classism, and because also the idea of, you know, many of the scholars of that generation were there were, you know, we were the sons and daughters of the migrants, los campesinos, you know what I'm saying? So there was this kind of condescension as well. I think that was a different era. I think it's now, you know, I think the relationships are much more in terms of, you know, equal and respect, because I have a lot of colegas in Latin America now that I feel, you know, very much mutual respect in our work, you know. But it's taken a lot of work to do that. So I didn't want to discount what you were saying, you know, but I just wanted to give some context to how a lot of the ways a lot of, you know, Chicanas and Chicanos felt about, you know, Mexican scholars as well. I mean, I was fortunate that I went to school in Mexico, you know, and preparatoria, and I also went, you know, as in elementary school, I went for 2 years, and then I went to preparatoria, you know, as well, and, you know, so I think, you know, I'm fluent in writing and in Spanish and all that. But, you know, a lot of our Chicana and Chicanos aren't, because they didn't learn, you know, school I mean, they didn't learn Spanish in school, they learned it at home, you know, and so it was vernacular Spanish. And so there was always this kind of condescension about it. But I think that that's changed a lot now. I mean, I'm hoping that it is, but I see it very, very different. You know, their relationship with us as Chicanas here is very different than it was in the past.
Well, I think too, one of what's changed as well is that, I mean, the whole prospect of this global world, right? I mean, it's like, and what I've been feeling lately, and I find it somewhat frustrating, is I feel like some of the things that we need to be talking about, because even people that are, you know, very, you know, it's like some of my conversations with some of the black scholars that I know, et cetera, and we're talking about the same thing, that nobody looks south. I mean, it's just like somehow everybody believes in the border, right?
Yeah.
But how do you even understand the history of slavery if you're not looking at the,
Brazil,
if you don't, yeah, if you're,
yeah,
you know, but
Colombia.
also that how can I mean, we even you know, in terms of people of color work here in the United States, you know, often it's like everybody still kind of believes in the nation state, that they still really are, right? And so for us, we never had, you know, and it's also the New England, New York, you know, like that's the center of the world, Washington, D.C., so the Northeast and not the Southwest, certainly not, you know, not the West Coast, the East Coast is what matters. Those are old relations that you know, that really counter any really, you know, logically acceptable way of looking at this part of the world. I like what Juan Rodriguez does on the martial law, right, about looking at Latin America, and that's still an old way of looking, you know, at you know, basically the South is still, you know, the lesser land, right? And those kind of prejudices make for less, you know, effective critical thinking, right?
Yes.
And so I find it somewhat frustrating, because I also kind of, I started out to say in the beginning is that we are not very visible nationally as critical thinkers, you know, Latinos in general, but Chicanos in specifically, you know, and so, and there's so much that could inform people's understanding of people of color politics, international politics, etc., if we, you know, had voice, you know, so.
And I think we've always been internationalists. I was just thinking about, you know, I mean, one of the things that appealed to me about, especially in South Texas, the Chicano, you know, movement in South Texas, it looked toward the third world. It looked at the non-aligned nations. It did look that way. But it's always, we've been configured as parochial. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
As a, you know, so.
And even questions about diaspora. I mean, this has changed somewhat. You're very right. Things have evolved. But it used to be that the notions of diaspora was based on who was the colony that, you know, who was the mother country that colonized you, right? So the black diaspora were English speaking. The native diaspora is still this way here in the United States. Yeah, you know, so I'm saying is that the notion of a native diaspora, right? That what are the connections happening? That's beginning to change, but largely it's just the English-speaking areas. So New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States, northern native folks, right? As opposed to the kind of intercambos that should be happening with the South, and Spanish-speaking, and also Chicanos, our relationship to indigeneity as well. So it's moving now. It's starting to change, but those have been like, it kind of, you know, I feel like it dumbs us down not to think that way, you know, not to be able to think internationally. Yeah, so good. Thank you, Coco, for your comment.
Creo que eso es todo. That's it for questions. I'm just going to read a comment from Norma Alarcón, who says,
Hi.
Thank you, compañeras. Haven't had such a good time in some time. And then also from Chela, who says, Rosa-Linda and Norma Alarcón, you inspire me.
We were actually talking about a get-together with Norma Alarcón, one of the meetings that you and I had. It was at my house in Oakland, and it was during the time when everybody smoked, so we had to sit outside, and Norma was number one
smoking. I remember that.
I know. I missed those days, but it was great. I was thinking about Norma and with Maine and all that happened, but I didn't want to write her because, you know, every time there's an earthquake in California, my family in Texas think it happened in Oakland, you know, so I said, I'm not going to write Norma about what happened in Maine because, you know, I feel like my family, you know.
Yeah, well, I think, Norma is one of those people that has impacted how we think critically I mean, more than, I mean, I think people don't know enough of it, you know.
Yeah.
But Norma, we got to bring, if you're out there, I guess you are, we're going to bring you to have these kind of conversations. Even if we have to
Definitely.
do it virtually, we will do it, I promise. Te prometo, te prometo.
Definitely. She needs to be here.
Yes, yes. I mean, she's our teacher, you know, she's our teacher, so, our maestra. So, anyway, Rosa-Linda, ha sido un puro placer hablar.
No, para
you know,
mí
this way too.
igualmente,
Yeah.
igualmente, Cheri.
I wish you every blessing on your road and just keep doing this really, really important work.
Yeah.
You know, we all need it. And until the next time.
Okay, thank you
Right.
so much. Thank you, and
No,
thank
no.
you to the centro, you know, de
Sí,
las
sí,
maestras
seguro que
for
sí.
por invitarme. Las maestras, I love that term, maestras. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
My students they're mostly from Mexico or Latin America and LALS, and always said maestra, and I love that.
It's
You know,
nice,
not
huh?
profesor. I like
Yeah.
maestra.
Yeah,
It looks,
it's
it's
nice.
beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Thank you.
gracias. And thank you to the folks here at Cruz Studio, you know, all those camera people back there, and Juan for supporting us. I also want to thank Mariela, who was the person, she does all of this, you know, our publicist, our program coordinator, and of course my compañera de vida, Celia Herrero Rodriguez. Anyway, gracias a todo, and we'll just talk more.
Yes,
Okay.
definitely. Gracias.
A ti.
Okay, hasta luego.